Hello and welcome to today's episode of the WonderLab. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Carl Trueman, the historian, theologian, and cultural commentator whose work illuminates how our modern ideas of identity came to be. He's best known for his books The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and Strange New World, which offer sharp insights into the cultural, intellectual, and technological forces shaping who we are and how we think. Today we dive into Dr. Trueman's views on history, faith, and what the future might hold as we grapple with questions of meaning and the self. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel and share with anybody who might be interested in the intersection of ideas, culture, and faith. Let's get started. Could you share a little bit about your intellectual past? Your what were the key influences? What were the sort of key thinkers or ideas that shaped the way you think about ideas, the way you think about the world?
Yeah, well, by long distance background, I was an undergraduate in classics at the University of Cambridge, and probably the person who had most intellectual impact on me there was my ancient history supervisor, Paul Cartledge, who's actually a card-carrying Marxist. But his approach to history and culture I found quite fascinating. It challenged me in a lot of ways. I'm not a Marxist myself, but that critical approach to culture that his own work embodied and his approach to history did have a formative influence on me. Then I went on at postgraduate level to study Reformation, really intellectual history, looking at ideas that emerged in the late 15th on through the 16th century. And in my postdoctoral work, well, I didn't have a formal postdoctoral position. I was already teaching in a university, but the work that I did after my PhD looked at 17th century Protestant thinkers and how they appropriated late medieval sources. And you might think that's a long way away from the stuff I've done since. But what that did was give me a thorough grounding, I think, in good method for approaching intellectual history and for approaching cultural questions.
How do you think about these movements of history? Is it individuals that shape history, or is it history that shapes individuals? Is there any thought you have on this engine that drives the move from one epoch to another?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, that is the big question of how to do history. Is it ideas that drive history, or is it material circumstances? Is it individuals, or is it sort of tectonic shifts within the culture? I think the answer is ultimately history is a complex of them all. One can see particular individuals, say, for example, Sigmund Freud, whose ideas have profoundly shaped a lot of modern thinking about sex and sexuality. Freud clearly is an intellectual influence. On the other hand, Freud's ideas can only become plausible and catch on in a society where certain material conditions apply. I use the example in class of sex. Yeah. People can only think of sex as recreational in a world where you have easy access to contraceptives and easy access to antibiotics. If you don't have those things, then sex is a highly risky activity socially. So there are definite material factors that play into this. And I think the way I look at it is the material factors make certain ideas plausible, and when certain ideas become plausible, they accelerate certain kinds of behaviors that can transform the material circumstances and so on and so forth. But it's really a complex. I think if we're going to understand our culture, we have to have a multi-dimensional approach to understanding the issues that press in on us.
At times, there seems to be progress in certain areas. At times, there's also decline. How do you, when you're evaluating history, there sort of a pessimistic approach would be things are getting worse and worse. An optimistic one would be things are getting better and better and better. When you're looking at these movements of history and seeing both progress and decline, how do you make an evaluation of the direction of history when we're talking about something of that scale?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question in a lot of ways. I think a couple of things. One thing that I find helpful is to understand that most positive developments also carry with them certain risks or difficulties. So the example I use in class often with the students is religious freedom. I'm a big fan of religious freedom, but religious freedom comes with a risk, and the risk is that it makes the church a consumer commodity. Congregants become consumers. It's a very different situation than one would have found in the early church or the medieval period. So bottom line is I've got to go for religious freedom, but in doing so, I understand that brings with it certain problems. The same with technology. Yeah, technology has certainly massively improved the physical quality of our lives in many ways. The advent of antibiotics, analgesics. Who would have wanted to have undergone even a minor surgical procedure in the 15th century? I would not have wanted to do that. There's a reason why people died early in those days. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the same technology that produces that also makes an Auschwitz possible. So I think on the one hand, we need to realize that talking in sort of blanket terms of improvement or decline, it's very difficult because usually improvements on one side can bring dangers and decline on the other. I would also come at it from an anthropological angle. I would say that we need to, the question I want to ask these days about developments is, do they enhance our humanity or do they detract from our humanity? Now, that in itself, I would need to give some philosophical justification of what I mean by humanity, etc., etc. That doesn't solve the problem. But coming from my Christian perspective, it's a sort of, so does this piece of technology, does it allow me to enhance my humanity? Does it make me more human? Or does it turn me into something else? Does it make me an object? Does it turn me into a part of a machine, for example? So that would be one question that I would want to ask. And thirdly, I would say that as a sort of good Augustinian pessimist, there's an element in which I see the task of, what is my task as a human being? It's always to mitigate the damage. Human beings, so we are committed to doing all kinds of damage to ourselves and to others. And the thing we need to realize is that the best we can do, we can never create utopia, I don't think, but we can mitigate the damage that we're doing. We can say that certain bits of legislation, for example, are better than others because they enhance our humanity, or they protect the innocent, or they protect the weak and the vulnerable. So that's a rather sort of random collection of thoughts, but those are some of the things that I'd want to bear in mind as I'm assessing history, rise and fall, decline, improvements, those kind of questions.
Right. I mean, that's a precursor to the question I really want to ask, which is this rise and triumph of the modern self, and what that has brought about. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about something like the self, we take for granted we know what the self is, and yet our experience of the self is actually especially in reading your book, is a modern invention. People didn't tend to think of themselves in the same way we think of a self. And I'm wondering, could you share a little bit about this? What is the self? How did somebody in the Middle Ages think of the self as opposed to the modern self? And then maybe we could kind of trace this story of how this came to be.
Yeah, I think the most straightforward way of getting this question is to ask another question and see how it would have been answered through history. If you were to say to somebody, who are you? How are they instinctively or intuitively going to answer that? Now, if I'd ask one of my ancestors in a village in rural England in the 13th century, who are you? The answer would have been pretty straightforward. They'd have said, well, I belong to such and such a family. I live in such and such a village. Let's say that they're the son of the blacksmith. They'd say, I'm the son of the blacksmith. I'm going to be a blacksmith when I'm older. The answer to who are you would be very simple and straightforward, largely because the anchors of identity are external and don't change. You could jump from 1200 to 1300 to 1400 in the same village and not see a lot of change. Obviously, the faces would change, but The family names would likely remain the same. The callings that are pursued by the people there would likely remain the same. The answers to that question, who are you, would likely run along a similar track over 300-400 years. Not much changes. When you think about that question today, it can be incredibly complicated. Who are you? But as you've already alluded to, that we struggle with that. Yes, I could give you my family, but I live 3,500-4,000 miles from my mother and my siblings. That doesn't tell you an awful lot about who I am in the present. I pursue a very different calling to that which my father pursued. I live in a different country. The rhythm of my life is very, very different, even to the rhythm of my life 40 years ago when I was a teenager. And the difference, I think, there, the obvious difference is that those external markers that were once very solid and very stable are now very fluid, even very unstable. And part of our reaction response to that, I think, has been to move inward. What is the one constant in my life? Well, it's this thing I call my self-consciousness. And we can get into complex philosophical debates about what self-consciousness is, but we have an intuitive sense that, hey, I'm me and I'm not you. And there's some connection between the me here and the me that was going to school in Gloucestershire 40-odd years ago. That move inward has become very important. And we see that at a sort of very basic level when, people will say, who are you? Well, I'm a very spiritual person, or I'm an introvert, or I'm an extrovert, or, given the sexual revolution, I'm straight, or I'm bi, or I'm gay. These are answers to the identity question that draw on what is inside rather than connect to what is outside. And that's what I try to get at in the book. And my argument is that, my answer to that question of why is it plausible to say you're a woman trapped in a man's body is precisely because we've come to give the authority we once gave to external realities to our inner feelings and desires.
In terms of that move from the outer sort of maps that would have told us who we are to this inner gaze and kind of exploration of self, what are the key reasons for that? What were the key moments that, if you were to chart that out, say, yeah, this is where we see this move? I mean, all the way back, Augustine had a sense of himself and that whole, but yet there was something that fundamentally shifted, it seems, in the modern period. But yeah, there's a historical journey you could take us on. It'd be interesting to know that move from the outer to the inner.
Yeah, I mean, Augustine's a good example because, one thing that people have said, when I've talked about books, yes, but Augustine had an inner life. Of course, I said, the psalmist had an inner life. What's interesting about Augustine's inward move, of course, is that he moves inward to move outward. Ultimately, his heart is restless until it finds rest in God. It's God, the external reality of God, that ultimately grounds his sense of self and his identity. And that gives us a clue, I think, as to some of the things that have happened in the modern age. I mean, one of the major challenges occurs with the Reformation, the shattering of the church. It takes a couple of 100 years for the full implications to be worked out culturally. But the shattering of church authority breaks one of the key external markers. In the Middle Ages, everybody in Western Europe is born a Catholic. You just are. By the time we hit 1800, you're having to choose your religion. And that's a big difference. We can also look at material factors. Here, the ghost of my old Marxist supervisor sort of kicks in, and we can think about how production has changed. Again, when you think about how we make things really does shape who we think we are. And there's a big difference between the blacksmith who learns his skill and is the only person who can do the blacksmithing in the village, to the person who works in an industrial factory in the 19th century and just presses a button. Pride in work is transformed at that point. The nature of skills are transformed at that point. Mobility of population, the rise of urbanization. That shatters the old stable village life. It's very interesting. One of my favorite English authors of the 19th century, Thomas Hardy, whose books are actually set in part of the country where I grew up in England. But a lot of his books revolve around the challenges faced by rural people from the rise of industrialism, and the question of identity and community rises. And there's also an intellectual narrative. We can see intellectuals responding to these challenges. We see it in, say, the Romantics in the late 18th, early 19th century. Religion is no longer strong enough to provide them with that sense of who they are and what the world is. So they look to Nietzsche. We see a figure like Nietzsche who calls the bluff on the Enlightenment. And he's the guy who says, hang on a minute, you can't get rid of God and then pretend everything stays just the same. And don't smuggle this human nature in and sneakily try to make it do the job that God used to do. If human beings are, if there is no God, we're not made in his image. Human nature can be anything we choose it to be. So there's an intellectual narrative as well. Again, going back to my earlier answer to one of your questions, where the story is a very complicated one. In my book, I choose the intellectual narrative, but clearly there is a cultural and material narrative as well that makes these ideas plausible and powerful.
Mm-hmm. You do some analysis of Rousseau as a key figure in this kind of the Romantic movement, the sense of it's a civilization that corrupts, that we're born sort of with this natural goodness, and there's this corrupting influence. So there's already a kind of move towards the individual as good, and the social structures are the problem. Could you share a little bit more about why is Rousseau such a key figure in this move toward, which kind of leads towards psychological man?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons why I chose to look at Rousseau in the book. One of them is, I think he's a very clear, he makes very clear statements about this sort of move to the inner space. I mean, he's not the only one. There are a lot of people in the 18th century wrestling with the authority of inner feelings. You can even find them in the conservative, confessional, Orthodox Christian world. Jonathan Edwards in colonial America is writing a book called The Religious Affections, around about the same time as Rousseau is wrestling with how do we understand emotions relative to who we are? What authority do we grant them? So that move inward is taking place in the 18th century. And Rousseau, I think, is a very fine, he's a fun, I find him a fun guy to read, and it is very clear what he's arguing for. One of the other reasons I chose him was that his ideas become very influential, particularly in education. If you're thinking about sort of child-centered learning, ultimately you're tracking back to Rousseau. So he does become a phenomenally influential thinker as well. So his ideas really came to grip the cultural imagination in a big way. And to the extent that all of us now acknowledge that, society does play a big role in shaping who we are. We are all heirs of Rousseau. So, I would put him as a kind of fountainhead. He's very influential on the later Romantics. And also, of course, on the French Revolution, which is another key marker there. You have the shattering of the French monarchy, another external hierarchical marker brought down. So Rousseau, very important.
Right. Is there something true in what Rousseau is saying, in that he's bringing forward something that maybe the ancients didn't see about the self, or is this a kind of invention of a make-believe inner world that you're not going to find that self? These are just kind of sort of inventions of the Romantics. I guess goes back to that question of progress and decline. Are they bringing something forward that could be salvaged, and from a Christian point of view, even saying, this is good and true, or is this really a kind of decline and a kind of fantasy world that we're in?
I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, one of the things I think that I believe helps to make a lot of this incorrect thinking plausible is that it's not entirely wrong, that it's touching on things of importance. So when Rousseau makes Rousseau's comments makes a comment effectively saying that, as soon as you have laws, something's gone wrong, because we should intuitively do the right thing. I think, well, when you think about it, most of us don't steal, not because it's illegal. It's not I'm going around thinking, I want to steal, but wow, it's illegal. I don't want to be punished. most of us don't steal because we think it's wrong not to steal. We don't want to do that. We look at the person who would be the victim of our theft, and we feel empathy for them, and we're not going to do. Most of us don't go around not beating people up because we think beating people up is a bad thing, because we share a humanity with others. So Rousseau is certainly onto something there. When you come to a figure like Freud, I would say Freud has in some ways, a much better understanding of human nature than Rousseau. And Freud does give fundamental credits to the darkness of human nature. Now, as a Christian, I would say that darkness comes about as a result of the fall. It's not how we're meant to be. It's how we are as a result of sin entering the world. But given that difference, Freud's analysis of what drives human beings, I think, can be fairly compelling. And his focus on sexual desire, when you think about it, is that something he's inventing, or is that something that's kind of important to being a human? And the example I always use in class with my students is, you read the Iliad. Why does the Iliad make sense? This is a poem written nearly 3,000 years ago about events taking place among heroes and gods in a land far, far away. And yet we can read it and understand it. Why? Because we understand sexual jealousy. We understand the power of sexual desire. The plot of the Iliad is, one guy steals another guy's wife, and the jilted husband gets together with his brother and goes to fetch her back. That's the basic plot. And that makes sense today, because the erotic and sexual desire, I think these are not social constructs. These are fundamental parts of what it means to be human beings. Now, the way different cultures express those things has a fair degree of social construction about it, but the desires themselves are fundamental. So when Freud writes, civilization is discontent, and essentially says, civilization is about the restriction of dark erotic desire, that makes sense. I think he's onto something there. So I would say these figures do grasp certain aspects of what it means to be a human being.
Freud's use of sexuality is in a way the primary identity marker of what it is to be a human being. And almost, it's this tragic sense of that, because there's ultimately no way to fulfill that given the deranged nature of those desires. Gets a bit transformed by Reich, Marcuse, this kind of politicization of sexual desire. That whole move, which kind of gives birth to the 60s, gives birth to the revolution that in a ways we're still in the wake of. Could you share a little bit about what is it that these thinkers who are influenced by Marxist ideas do with Freud, and how is that a kind of almost a nuclear bomb culturally?
Yeah. Well, what they do, of course, is they say Freud's right that societies need sexual codes because you can't have everybody doing anything they want sexually. It would be chaos. It would be hell for women. It would be a disaster for everybody but the strongest males. And the strongest males aren't strong for very long. They're soon going to be replaced. So Freud's basic argument is that human beings, society trades off a portion of happiness for a better chance of surviving over a longer period of time. Civilization, in other words, involves a restriction of the sexual aim in a way that allows us to live together better for longer. What the Marxists of the Reichs and Marcuses do is say Freud is correct that sexual codes are key to the nature and shape of society, and they're important for societies. But they say where Freud is wrong is that he's missed the sort of the insight of the Hegel-Marx trajectory of thinking, which historicizes things. And that what Freud has missed is the fact that the kind of rules we have about sex are necessary to preserve this kind of society, which for them, of course, is the bourgeois capitalist society. So they identify sexual codes as propping up or supporting or enabling capitalist exploitation. So whereas for Marx the Marx of the 1840s is saying we have to dismantle religion in order to get people to realize what is really in their best interests. The Marxists like Reich and Marcuse argue, no, we need a gun for the way bourgeois society makes us feel about sex and sexual morality. We have to tear down the sexual mores of middle-class society in order to destabilize and prepare the way for the great Marxist revolution. Now, today, a lot of us sexual revolutionaries don't necessarily buy into a Marxist view of history, but that idea that sexual codes are oppressive and unnecessarily so, and they are preventing us from being our real selves, has really struck very deep roots in our culture and is, of course, promoted by endless Hollywood movies, talk show hosts, etc., etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. You use this term, the expressive individualism, and what is it about this this move? So after the 60s, there's a sense in which there's a move where I need to come to grips with who I am deep down inside, but then I need to express that, and I need other people to affirm that. What is that? What is the play between those two moves? This discovery within, and then this kind of presentation and need for the affirmation on the outside.
Yeah, well, in some ways it tracks back to Rousseau. I mean, Rousseau's, and you find this picked up by some of the romantics like William Wordsworth, for example. The idea is that you are your original primeval desires because society corrupts you. And what society does is it molds you into its own image, and therefore you play society's game. And in other words, your outward actions are not really who you are. You live a lie. Oscar Wilde has this comment where he says, most people live the lives of other people. Their opinions are a quotation. And what he means by that is we're not authentic. And expressive individualism is the idea that in order to be truly me, I have to be able to express outwardly those things that I feel inwardly. And often in the newspaper interviews or the newspaper reports, you'll hear the language of, I used to be living a lie. Now I'm finally free to be myself. Caitlyn Jenner, the interview with Diane Sawyer, used very, very similar language about finally able to be myself. That's expressive individualism. That's the idea that who I am is my core inner feelings. And if society or you stop me living those outwardly, you're forcing me to be somebody that I am not. And this, the Freud dimension of this is if those inner desires are fundamentally sexual, then expressing individualism will default to forms of sexual expression, ultimately, which I think is where we are in our world today.
Mm-hmm. You've written about, I think in your introduction, you talk about the influence of Philip Rieff and Psychological Man. And I'm just curious, his influence on your work, and where do you see what did you take from him, and what did you sort of bring forward in this this idea of a fundamental way of thinking about humanity as psychological?
Yeah, I think Rieff was very important for my own thinking on this. Rieff, of course, was a very great Freud scholar, not an uncritical Freud scholar, though. He has a lot of criticisms of Freud. I think what Rieff pointed to, there were a couple of things where I really benefited from Rieff. One of them was he really brings out how the fact that changes in sexual codes, changes in sexual morality are of fundamental importance to society. President Trump could increase the speed limit on the federal highways by 5 miles an hour, and that would have some significance. But it's not going to fundamentally change the nature of American society. He could increase federal income tax by a cent, he could drop it by a cent. It'll make some difference, but it won't fundamentally change the nature of society. Rieff's point, building on Freud, is when you start changing in fundamental ways what is and is not acceptable sexual behavior, you're doing something very fundamental to the society itself. These are not incidental changes. These are things that have profound repercussions for the way we think about, for example, the family, or the way men and women relate to each other, is the way we think about children. So that was very important to me from Reef. The second thing was his argument that society today, this expressive individualist society, is qualitatively different from what has gone before. Society's changed over time, and the notion of self has changed over time, etc., etc. But the thing that Reef thinks is a big difference today is, in the past, the purpose of, say, education was to bring up the individual in a way that taught them the skills they needed to conform to society at large. It was outward looking. Reef's argument is that actually the modern therapeutic society sort of does the reverse. Society itself is expected to accommodate to the desires, the foibles, etc. of the individual. And that fundamental change of direction changes everything. You think of the political scientist Yuval Levine's argument that institutions have moved from being places of formation to places of performance. When I went to school, I joked to the students at Grove, so when I went to school, the purpose of schooling was to smash your individuality and make you part of the team. That's why we played rugby in the winter and cricket in the spring. Team sports were a central part of English grammar school curriculum circa 1980. And that was not it was not because they wanted to give us some recreation. It was to teach us that the team is more important than the individual. Today, think of the way colleges market themselves typically. It's about come and find your fulfillment. Be the best version of you. It's become a much more individually oriented thing, catering to the individual rather than making the individual part of the team.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What impact has this had on religion? I mean, one of the chapters in Reef's book that I thought was very interesting to me, I had earlier interest in Carl Jung and some of the ways in which he brings in religious stories and myths, but does so in a very therapeutic kind of context. What has the rise of the therapeutic done to the fundamental understanding of what the purpose of religion is about, really?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And when you think, who's the most successful, on paper, who's the most successful pastor in the United States of America in terms of just the size of his congregation? It's Joel Osteen in Houston. Well, Joel Osteen's message, you only have to look at the titles of his books to know what his message is. Your best life now, make every day a Friday. He's a sort of life coach with a Christian idiom. It's sort of come to Jesus and, fulfill the American dream. It's a very therapeutic gospel. It's not, as Reef says, it's not the cry of the ascetic anymore. When you think of early church religion, when you think of medieval religion, when you think of the Reformation, religion was seen, as a way of explaining to people why life was so miserable. Today, it's become a sort of a toolkit of making life happy and comfortable. That's it's a somewhat simplistic way of putting it, but Christianity's become therapy in many, many churches.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you see this the therapeutic, the psychological man, the therapeutic man? Do you see that still holding? Or is there something new that's developing with the kind of virtual world we're in? Is the virtual world with these kind of avatars that young people live on social media, is this still a form of expressive individualism? Or is there a shift that we're seeing in this move towards a new kind of collectivism, where there's the sense in which I'm expressing myself, but I don't think there's ever been more kind of conformity, perhaps in human history, in terms of the way in which you oftentimes you talk to people the same ideas that everybody else has. yeah, I guess the relationship between the psychological man of the 1960s, 70s, etc., and is there a shift that we're seeing now with this complete dominance of the technological world, the virtual world we're in?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there are a couple of, again, I would say points of continuity and discontinuity. One of the points of continuity between earlier iterations of therapeutic psychological man and what we see in this technological world, of course, is the downgrade in the importance of the body.
Yeah.
If psychological man is, my body is a kind of tool for expressing the person that I really am, that there's this kind of spooky thing that inhabits my body like a astronaut inhabits a spacesuit. My body is not me. It's a tool. It's an extension that allows me to realize myself or express myself in some way. Mm-hmm. And I think the development of technology has furthered that tendency to disembodiment. Secondly, I think technology is making that question of who I am even more complicated than it was before, because those external physical anchors that used to apply, even down to friends. Who are my friends? Well, they're the 6 or 7 guys that I hang around with and I go to the pub with once a week and this kind of thing. No, who are your friends? And which is another way of asking, who are you? That's becoming a very, very complicated question. The conformity side of things is interesting, though, and there we get down to, isn't it interesting how, as you pointed out, a tool that should be a tremendous weapon for individualism is creating new kinds of conformity, virtue signaling that becomes compulsory, etc., etc. At this point in time, it's too early for me to be able to reflect with any depth on this, but it does seem that what we're seeing emerging is something that was sort of true all along, but we didn't realize it. And Charles Taylor, Canadian philosopher, makes this point. He says, we experience life, we think of our identity as a monologue, but it's actually always a dialogue. Mm-hmm. I joke in class, I give a lecture once a year on I said, one of the deepest philosophical questions you'll ever come across. Why do all teenagers dress the same? You ask a teenager, why do you dress in that terrible way that you do? The answer comes back, well, it's an expression of my uniqueness and who I am. To which the follow-up question is, so why does every other teenager dress in exactly the same way? And I think what we see in the sort of tech world is that kind of thing playing out. How it develops, I don't know. And of course, there are other issues involved. The way that power now operates in the tech world, and conformity can be driven in what we might call soft and unnoticeable ways. Now, that's an interesting question too. Algorithms and all these other things play into it. It's an immensely complicated question, but I think your observation that, we have such tremendous opportunity to be individuals now, and we're all starting to conform. Answering that is going to be one of the big questions of the next 10, 20 years. Why is that happening? What are the reasons that is happening?
Do you see, while there's a lot of conformity, there's also something else happening where these echo chambers that people are living in, the inability for real dialogue, the kind of evaporation of any idea of universal truths, I don't know if you have any reflections on that and what that might be leading us towards. Is it a kind of retribalization, as McLuhan thought? I don't know what reflections you might have on that.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to McLuhan on that point. I think when the internet first sort of exploded onto the scene, there was a sense in which I think there was a lot of optimism that now we're going to see a democratization. Yeah. We're going to see all people are going to have access to the truth, this kind of thing. What's actually happened, I think Neil Postman predicted this. What's actually happened is when you have an almost infinite deluge continually of information, your ability to handle it evaporates. And you end up not with a sort of dramatically enhanced and strengthened public square where intelligent dialogue and informed dialogue can take place on a grander, a more pungent scale than has ever been seen. what you actually end up with is a sort of chaotic tribalism, conflict, civil war. You see the emergence of new authoritarianisms because somebody's got to control somebody's got to try to get this thing by the throat and bring it under control. So I think we're seeing, the shift from that initial democratic optimism to, gosh, this is chaotic. And of course, I remember 25 years ago when I first came to the stage, or 24 years ago, people would complain about, there's some people and all they do is they watch MSNBC, or all they do is watch Fox News. And so they just get their information curated to them to confirm their biases already. If that was the case then, it's much more the case now with these packages. I would also say the form is problematic as well, because many of the most important questions in life are not susceptible to tweetable answers. They're complicated. And we're seeing this emergence of influencers who think in barely coherent sentences of 160 characters or whatever it is, and opine on issues with authority that they're clearly incompetent to opine on, and don't opine on with any great thoughtfulness. And that's becoming something of a default for how we think about discussion in the public arena. And that's, it's as if the Reformation, the conflicts in the 16th century produced great theological treatises, Calvin's Institutes, Ignatius of Loyola's Exercises. It produced Robert Bellarmine, for example, very sophisticated thinkers. But it also produced a lot of pamphlets that were by and large total garbage and were just designed to sort of beat up the opposition in some way. It's as if we're in a world where we're not getting the great stuff. We're just getting the pamphlets at this point. And that doesn't bode well, I don't think. I've noticed even the standard of prose among a lot of journalists seems to have declined. And I'm thinking that may well be because they spend most of their day reading or writing on X. And it's crippled their ability to express themselves in thoughtful paragraphs. So I think that the form of the internet and the form of online exchange, there are many, many aspects to it, many of which I think present problems.
Do you have a sense of what, you're a historian, but if you were to put on the hat of a futurist, what are the key things now that thinkers, journalists are not writing about, but 50, 100 years from now we'll be looking back, and those will be sort of the key strands of the key things that were really at play in our own time? Do you have a sense of what is not being looked at closely enough?
Yeah, I think what I see is the resurgence of a kind of eugenics approach to things. It's not that it's not being written about. It's just that many of what I consider to be the manifestations of it are being seen as unequivocal goods. The IVF issue goes without any major public debate or discussion. It's just assumed to be an unequivocal good. And I think that's because a lot of the tech bro guys are really eugenicists. And I'd like to see the discussion about AI even, for example, not being pursued as a simple discussion about AI and replacing human beings, but how does it connect to a broader anthropology that sees human nature as something to be overcome or technologically improved upon? And I'm just not seeing a whole lot of writing. It's starting to emerge, I think, but I think transhumanism is the big issue. I think transhumanism, eugenicism, these things are the things that I suspect will become the big issues of the next 10, 15, 20 years. And I'm not at the moment seeing them being addressed with I would say, it may sound like contradicting, with the depth in the popular press that they need to be. Everybody needs to be aware about these issues, and that requires a certain kind of writing that isn't really happening at the moment. And it's interesting. I had It was actually a Muslim friend was invited to go to the Vatican for a conference that Pope Francis put on a couple of years ago on, I think it was on artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. And it was a meeting of leaders in the tech world, Silicon Valley types, and religious and not just religious, but I think religious and philosophical types. And my friend told me that on day one, all of the tech guys made their presentations, and on day two, the religion philosophy section stepped forward to make presentations. And his comment was that all of the tech guys had left by day two. They gave their presentations and they left. They really weren't interested in having their work put in any kind of theological or moral context. And that is, if that's an accurate account, that's very worrying, I think. Very worrying indeed. It's as if, we develop the A-bomb or the H-bomb without any real care for the moral context in which an H-bomb may or may not be used.
I suppose, is that an aspect of the modern self as well? This just trying to go beyond any limit? There's no sense of limit. There's no givedness. It's all up for grabs to create
I think
whatever.
So. It's a Promethean thing. I mean, I would say it's part of human nature, of course. It's just that technology has allowed our Promethean aspirations to divinity to be far more plausible to us than they were in 1500. If you aspire to be a god in 1500, there's a limit to your godlike powers in 1500 that we don't face so much now. I mean, Sartre put it, Jean-Paul Sartre, after the war, made the comment, this age is qualitatively different to every age that's gone before it, because for the first time in human history, human beings have to decide they want to continue to exist. We now have the power to wipe ourselves out that we never had before. And I think what Sartre was describing in the 40s is even more the case today.
What is an approach, a Christian approach to this context that could help retain some level of humanity in the midst of this with the great unknowns of where this is all heading?
Yeah, I think on one level, we have limited power as individuals over the big picture. Where we do have influences in our own families, in our own communities. Now, I don't think that unplugging in a radical way is an option for most people. Most of us are very dependent on technology in some way. And that's not a bad thing. I live 4,000 miles from my mother, but I can talk to her every week if I wish, pick up the phone and call my mum. There are great things about modern technology.
Absolutely, yeah.
We're all tied into modern technology. The key, I think, is to be aware of how it shapes how we think and behave. That isn't the solution, but it's the beginning of the solution. Being self-conscious about how technology affects us. And then you mentioned children, of course. I think a peculiar responsibility falls on parents here. I plug the work of a colleague of mine at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Claire Morrell. She has a book coming out from Penguin Random House in the next couple of months, which is designed to help parents understand the role of technology in their children's lives and how it shapes their children, and to give them some strategies for helping children use technology in a thoughtful, humanizing way. Mm-hmm. So I think for parents, parenting, being a parent has always been complicated. It's even more complicated now because you've got to deal with technology. I think for parents, be informed about these things and develop strategies that allow you to teach your kids to think wisely about the role of technology in their lives.
Just to conclude, is there, in terms of your current interests, current work, questions you're wrestling with, is there, what are the key things you're doing already, or new writing that you're working on?
Yeah, I've got a book coming out in the fall from Sentinel entitled The Desecration of Man, where I argue that I'm sort of building on C.S. Lewis's abolition of man and arguing that it's not just that we haven't just abolished human nature, we've desecrated it. We take a peculiar delight in the destruction of what it means to be human. And the other project I have is I'm working on a book on Thomas Aquinas on virtue for Protestants. It's great. I'm a big fan of Thomas Aquinas, have been for many, many years. And I think that the notion of virtue has been much neglected. particularly in Protestant Christianity. And as has been clear from some of my answers, I think in this hour, it's hard to predict the future. We don't know what craziness is coming around the corner. But if we're virtuous people and we bring up our children to be virtuous, then we should have the moral qualities to be able to think appropriately and respond appropriately to whatever nuttiness the world throws at us in the next decade. So I want to try to open up the whole world of Catholic thinking about virtue for my Protestant audience.
Right. That's excellent. Well, I've always been nourished by your writing. I really appreciate you sharing, your insights with us. And I look forward to working with you on future projects as well, some of the documentary work as well. So thank you very much, Carl, for your time.
Thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure as always.